Twitch your trigger finger, the humans seem to have with the doves as the humans. Refer to the more peace-minded council. Members advocating for mankind to demilitarize itself out of both fear and exasperation. But humanity never once rested there. Guns down, and I kept a long vigil for anyone that ever tried to fight a war against them. And since humanity was a neutral and independent party amongst the Galata community, the Alliance relented and allowed the paranoid species to keep their vigilance even when it seemed the galaxy had no enemies for them to point their weapons at. Seemed, because after a measly 10 years of living with humanity, neglected Alliance finds itself at the forefront of a war against another coalition of species. One is bloodthirsty and trigger-happy as they initially thought humanity was. The Uravel Empire surprised the Alliance when their research vessel encountered them, showed them when used to the vessel being destroyed was received, and horrified them when the system were found it was soon under attack with mass reports of growing casualties of both military and civilian kind. The Alliance quickly assembled their defense forces from Mat Dash to stop the Urava's advance in his tracks, having put together what might possibly be the first full-blown fleet with the appropriate army accompanying it, and sent them forth to put the Empire's march to a halt. Unfortunately, the Empire had found a perfect playground for his own troops as soon as War Machine was pointed towards the Alliance fully. The defensive fleet was battered down to the last ship with casualties reported and unreported happening, and the Alliance soon finds themselves facing an opponent that might very well take it down entirely after so many years of prosperity and a desperate bid to store their own. Fool, the Alliance propped up whatever forces they could muster to slow in the march of Uravel forces that preyed upon their people. Divisions and armies were drafted and trained quickly to contest and defend the worlds under attack from the invaders' own troops, and fleets and ships were built and formed to contest with orbital supremacy. But it soon became a losing battle on all fronts. Strained by this suddenly to defend itself, the Alliance were quickly scraping the barrel to do whatever it took to stop the invading menace. It wasn't until the Uravel Empire was mere steps away from the core systems did salvation arrive for the Alliance. Salvation in the form of humanity's own War Machine would have been a steady advance into their core system, stored only by their desperate attempts, and fleets soon came to a screeching halt when humanity walked in their own fleece and harvest to the Alliance's front yard. What should have been a massacre ground to a contested conflict that saw both Uravel forces and humanity's forces fighting for now to push each other back, with the Alliance providing whatever aid they could give for their allied War Machine. Defensive lines are formed and stabilized as humanity put their seemingly entire war effort into stopping the Empire's advance into Alliance systems. The logistics chains were created to ensure this line of guns and ships never faltered against the enemies. Humanity speaks of carriers and escort. Carriers walked in with the escorts, consisting of cruisers, frigates, and corvettes to provide an iron wall that protected the Alliance behind it, with masses of soldiers and pilots and non-combat personnel to man the defense of what would be called the fortress systems. And as Alliance formed and held, humanity came to the Alliance's aid in the form of something they called land, leased for their armed forces as humanitarian aid for the war refugees. With the influx of war material and the economy behind it provided by mankind, the Alliance armed forces soon finds its footing yet again and began to rebuild itself to fight the menace to their existence with their stored ally. And with intergalactic aid coming from the civilian district of mankind, the Alliance's many displaced citizens soon finds themselves properly treated, fed, and housed, and even allowed the opportunity to help the war effort in some other way. Soon the Alliance was given the opportunity to regain their breathing, with humanity bearing the brunt of the Uravel Empire's assault until they managed to get their feet up, and what had been a dire situation for the Alliance was turned into one of hope, when the Uravel Empire was unable to penetrate through the defensive lines as they rebuild themselves with arms and armor that was born from countless battles and wars. Humanity's armed forces and the Alliance armed forces took on and dealt equally savage blows to the Uravel Empire's armies, and with ships created with the experience of an absurd amount of conflicts, mankind and the Alliance battered their ground down the Empire's own ships as they attempted to push through the fortress erected by them. The terrace fleets was something else. If you aren't seeing their smaller ships firing their cannons, sending out missiles and knocking out fight across and missiles out of the void, you'll be seeing their carriers provide long-range firepower, or their fight airplanes become a screen of PDWS missiles and electronic warfare systems that mess up the Aravel's own ships that pass through them. Cats and the Dharma ballast recounting the void battle above an Alliance world, seeing human soldiers charge onto a year of our slaughter squad meeting their savage glee with their own fury before they died as they covered our retreats, was a sight I couldn't forget. Not when the slaughter squad seemed stunned, maybe even a little scared, as someone even crazier than them, Knight Sergeant Drakisvar the 7th Boardwalk Legion, on account of his squash retreat with the Tyrants, remaining soldiers from the 7th Army Guard Unit. Human pilots are nothing if not crazy. A double a screen covering over one of our men's position. From heaven and hell, as they said, they gave those men the support they needed to push through the Urin's lines. Captain Frag Torgala of the Toff Army, witnessing human fixed air providing them with much-needed air support, and when the assaults ground to a full halt, when the IRA Val Empire could not sustain their advance and the defensive lines were stable and strong, the Alliance suit learned that the fleets and men that came to the raid were nothing but QFIS, quick reactionary forces, forces that were always on standby for any invasion or assault that's meant to stall the enemy until the true offensive. Fleets were mobilized. When the counteroffensive began, the Alliance bore the sight of the humans' full might in all its fears and glory. The escort ships, if there could even be called escort ships at all, walked in first at the Krillian system ahead of their capital ships. Still Fregus and heavy destroyers formed hunter packs with batteries and missile pod brimmed across their shielded and armored surfaces, and heavy cruisers soon came after with their spinal cannons are much larger defensive arrays than their supercarriers walked in, and Alliance forces had noted that it was a spectacle to see just large ships, dwarfing most of their escorts in their sheer size, brimming with many fighter airings are, both manned and unmanned variety, which has an extensive array of weapons to employ with an even more extensive network of gun batteries, missile pulse, and PDWS across their surfaces, and coupled with powerful spinal cannons. Most of the Alliance's military were unable to comprehend just how the humans managed to construct and maintain such ships, and that wasn't accounting for the other ships that joined, in particularly their ground forces ships, assault carriers, carrying at time Marine divisions with relevant armor, strike art, and transport, followed in close with the supercarriers, and screened further by corvettes and frigates responsible for keeping their carriers safe and provide orbital support for the Marines. Along with them are logistical ships meant to support the fleet on total repair and rear ships, medical ships, and the ever-elusive intelligent ships that would provide strategic knowledge over the war. It was then the counteroffensive began. As it was there did humanity showed just how ready they were to fight a war. As the police began pushing the Uraval Empire back for the Alliance Corps, systems retaking world after ravish, world and system after disposed system. The utter efficiency and affected this human wage war became apparent. Whilst the fleets are engaged, the supercarriers will begin sending out their fighter craft by the dozens, scores of banned fighters accompanied by unmanned ones with former provide a racer wall of lethal wounds and potential death with anti-fighter and anti-ship munitions and all assisted and covered by electronic support crafts. They are providing much needed survivability for them. Behind them would be the escort ships, and they provide the heavy firepower needed when the fighter craft weren't enough. Energy bowls, missiles, and projectiles will be sunk across the void and fall. Every return fire received their shields. Armor and point defense array were more than enough to protect them. When orbital supremacy was achieved over a planet, the ground forces fleets would swoop into orbit and begin eliminating the enemy ground defenses as well. Corvettes and frigates would tread between void and atmosphere to begin orbital bombardment of no military targets, and the assault carriers would deploy transports and strike craft to clean out resistance where older weaponry were dangerous to use. Even the ground troops were given the most support for this endeavor, including the typical armed support of tanks and heavy mechs. The human marines would utilize artillery of all flavor and air support are both fixed swing and veto kind to maximum effect, in addition leaving no chance for the enemy to survive encounters with them, all while supply for the most updated intel and the most comprehensive logistical chain they are provided for the men and women of the counteroffensive. And one by one humanity and the Alliance pushed back the Uraval Empire up until they reached the initial border of Alliance space. Here the Alliance Council members pulled in the reins of their armies and navies and formed a thick line of guns and armor and ships to never again be forced into a situation of desperation like in the early phase of the war. Here both Alliance and humanity began rebuilding the rubbish worlds left behind by the Val Empire, and a sense of it was given to the traumatized populace that had been unfortunately left to fend for themselves when the initial defense forces fell. Assisted by humanity's war machine, the Alliance was able to keep their borders up and made it into a meat grinder that had the Uraval Empire frame more and more their own forces into it to break it once more. Soon the roles were reversed, and suddenly the Empire was on the back foot as it attempted to push the joint defensive line. And though the Alliance was mostly rebuilding their economy and infrastructure, though the general populace was allowed their homes again, humanity went forth to push back the Uraval imperialists further into their own territory, where some of the Alliance's own fleets, joining in after receiving permission, they pushed the coalition back into each of the collectors' home systems and surrender them individually, and with each of the integral war species cut off. On the Empire their armies dwindled in capabilities until finally a message was received from them, a message of empty threats and hence surrender. It was noted that when the Alliance and humanity sent in their diplomats to speak with the Empire's zone, the various species responsible it represented, the Empire looked uncomfortable sitting with them entirely. I don't think they've ever been forced into this situation. I don't even think any of them thought this would have happened, but here they were, and I don't think they like it. Ambassador Alex Torres. And after brokering a treaty, the Alliance was then surprised when Humanity offered aid to the defeated. Enemy, I'll just seeing the way the human war. Machine worked I don't want to seeing. How they battered and warred. Seeing them offer a knowledge branch. Towards the enemy was by far the most absurd thing for the Alliance. And as years went by as a war machine, winds down and the economy began to recover, the Alliance witnessed what could be only described as a miracle as the species comprising the Uraval Empire were re-educated and rehabilitated into members of society that could be reason to live within his place. The urban coalition was formed and the Alliance and humanity enjoyed a galactic society with this third party. It was around this formation did the Alliance Valley inquire with humanity upon his stars in the galaxy. You confuse us greatly, Ambassador. Councilwoman Sarah grumbled. Did she lean back on her seat, her talents rubbing the area just before her beak to ease the slowly forming migraine she felt. Alex just smiled in empathy at her words, and quit smiling with humor in his tone. At least you don't have to deal with us on a daily basis. His colleague Albert has sighed roughly, and the brown-haired man grunted in pain, before giving Yvonne a look which has zero effect on her as she said flatly at him, for her glasses, one of the council members, an insectoid male that looked vaguely better inspired, after the casual display of annoyance gave his own avian colleague a look, before leaning forward and stifling his claws together on the table, his vibrating voice near harmonic as he added his own words to the discussion. Much as I find it amusing, I agree with. Councilor Thera humanity has since showed itself capable of both war and peacetime duty with remarkable efficiency on both ends, and for once, we'd like to have a definite answer as to how it's even possible. The U-shaped table allowed all the Alliance's council members to look at each other and the person of interest equally, and so when the council member spoke the question of the Jew of humans that set before the U-shaped table, all of them leaned forward to hear them explain themselves. Both Alex and Yvonne gave each other a look where they heard the question, one stern but conflicted and one casual but resigned, and eventually the blonde ambassador put her data back down, assembled her fingers together before leaning back, allowing Alex to take center stage of their attention. Feeling eyes all on him, the ambassador turned to face the council with a pensive look on him, his lips in as he pressed them together, and he spade his hands on the table firmly as he righted himself in his chair. Then he opened his mouth ready to speak, but no worse came out. For a few moments the Burnett ambassador moved his lips awkwardly as he tried to articulate sentences to explain how the human mind generally looked at war and peace, finding himself wearing words afterwards away because they were too complex, philosophical, and just outright long, until we've had a hand if only squeeze his shoulder, Yvonne having provided her support for whatever he chose to speak about. It was enough for him to shut his mouth up and had him taken in a deep breath as he considered the most basic way of humanity's stance in war and peace. He finally found the most proper way to explain. What would you feel after having been bullied? There was silence amongst the council members as they carefully processed his words, and then a feline council member spoke up with clear confusion in his tone pattern. Alex shifted his eyes towards the council member, giving him a heavy glance, and repeated this question: what do you feel after being beaten down, harassed, and generally exploited by someone? Do you feel like he wanted them to stop at any means necessary, maybe roll over and beg for your life, give them some sort of sacrifice to appease them? He added carefully, slowly, so as to frame his words as intellectual questions. Or maybe you fight back and beat him up as hard as they beat you out to make sure they never beat you up again. He finished his question in each end, every council member carefully to gaze. Their reactions. Some looked conflicted, others looked thoughtful, and if you look somber. Seeing the general reactions of human, Ambassador then leaned forward, face still neutral but now possessing a hint of sternness to it, and gave his answer to his own question. Humanity had a lot of bullets in his time growing up, a lot of men and women who thought they could push around others for their own gains, and usually they'd never last long because the people had enough of their. Some even clawed their way into leadership roles and drove their country into the ground because they wanted more than what they had, and so invaded others to expand their personal dream of a dictatorship with them at the top. And because of people like this existing, we could never really get ourselves to relax one bit in case of people like them managing to rise up the ranks. And so long as people can think freely, so long as they can have their own opinions and outlooks, there's always a chance someone would think they deserve better, or no one does. Yvonne was now looking down, keeping yourself uncharacteristically quiet, and Alex simply had a long look at his features as he recounted the bloody history of mankind with a simple analogy to better be understood. Even the council members all looked at each other after the ambassador's question in silence regarding their own species' history. Blinking, the brunette then focused his eyes back, and he sat up straight again before finishing his answer with a small smile. So you can call that attitude an unfortunate necessity if you want, because we've seen enough of this in our own people. Finally gotten their answer, the Alliance Council remained silent as the human ambassadors cleaned up their desk. They left the council with a lot to consider. Have a multiplication sign